Okay, here we go. NSCA Chapter 19, Presentation number 5. We're talking about hyperlipidemia, and we'll talk about some of the comorbidities in between cardiovascular disease and hyperlipidemia. So if we look at hyperlipidemia, and I'll kind of go right from the book over here, it's a general term for elevated concentrations of any or all of the lipids, fats in the blood, such as cholesterol, triglycerides, and lipoproteins. In general, your client will come in and say, I have high cholesterol. And then it becomes a conversation like, well, what does that mean? Do you have the numbers, et cetera? We can go over that. Dyslipidemia refers to abnormal lipid or fat levels in the blood. Now, for sake of our conversation and the book and any quiz questions, anything going forward, just when they refer to dyslipidemia, they seem to focus more on blood concentrations more than anything else. And hyperlipidemia is just kind of a global term reserved for the entire body itself. So just realize dyslipidemia seems to be geared more towards those questions regarding elevations of lipids in the blood. Atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, hardening of the arteries, and low density lipoproteins contribute to the fatty buildup and the narrowing of the arterial walls, which is atherosclerosis. Okay, so if you think of this in terms of just like the pipes in your body, what you're doing is you're losing the elasticity in those pipes. And that elasticity allows blood pressure to vacillate. If you remember, systolic, diastolic, systolic, diastolic, as there's pressure exerted by the heart to push the bloods, there's pressure in the pipes, which is the vascular system. And there has to be some elasticity in those pipes to allow for that pressure. Otherwise, that's how we get high blood pressure. So you can kind of start to put together some of the interconnectedness of like high blood pressure and atherosclerosis and hyperlipidemia. It becomes a conversation of like how these things are all interconnected. So for the sake of the conversation in the book, they list as lower is better, which is perfect. It's like, okay, you want to lower the better for any kind of cholesterol. And what they note is LDL below 100, HDL above 40. And this goes back to our 8+1 format when we start talking about cardiovascular disease, because we want that HDL to be higher and we want the LDL to be lower. We know that in that 8+1, the one question or the one evaluation that we have is HDL. If HDL is higher, that means there's a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, the book itself lists total cholesterol at 150. You'll have people that'll come in and it'll be kind of all over the place, but just realize you're trying to have this 150, 140 or better, 40 or better scenario. The book here lists multiple causes. I can move myself out of the way here a little bit. With the multiple causes, you can kind of start to read through these, and it's the etiology. And you can see abdominal obesity, which is that android obesity, sedentary lifestyle, overweight, poor diet, insulin resistance, glucose intolerant. You go further down into low HDL levels, right? So you have high HDL, or high LDL, and high HDL and low HDL. Over here you have overweight, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. So you can start to put together much of what we've done with the 8-in-1 format gives you perspective regarding some of the possible causes that a person will have in their life that will cause high LDL, low HDL, increased triglycerides, possible glucose intolerance, possible type 2 diabetes, maybe android obesity. Perhaps they have a sedentary lifestyle. So you can start to put together the 8-in-1 with this table right here and really have a good conversation and understanding of why we ask those questions on the front end when we evaluate people, because there's such a strong relationship between these comorbidities. When we talk about fat modification, the book itself, when they go into this, they should choose foods rich in monosaturated and polyunsaturated fats from olive and canola oils, nuts, seeds, avocados, flaxseed, soy, which I'm on board with, but you got to understand you're going to have some people that come in and they'll be kind of picky about what type of oil they want to cook with or what type of oil they want to have in their diet. And, you can only go so far with people. But I will tell you this, when you start talking about dietary fat, there's the conversation of how much fat is in the diet in the macronutrient side, and then what type of fat it is. And it's definitely within your interest to have a background understanding about like omega-3. And the book really spends some time here on omega-3 being the one type of essential polyunsaturated fat that has additional protective benefits, right? So people will come in and they'll be versed in this, and it helps to have a conversation regarding this topic. And I can tell you, when you look at like cold water fish like mackerel, salmon, herring, and sardines, the saying used to be like the deeper the fish, what was it? The colder, it was something like the colder the fish, the better the dish, or something. It was something along those lines, because it was, fish that swam in colder waters would have higher amounts of omega-3s, and it was a benefit. And it was like a quirky little mnemonic to help you remember that. But then you had to remember all the fish that swam in cold water. It was kind of silly. But long story short, what they're getting across here is you're looking for food sources that have omega-3s to help people not only lower triglycerides, but also have the other positive benefits associated with having omega-3s in the diet. And they give some suggestions about protective benefits and how often, et cetera, which, you can have those conversations with your clients regarding how often, you should have omega-3 type food. But again, you always have to have some boundary in place in terms of how much guidance or direction you want to offer, unless, of course, you have some kind of background in nutrition. So they go into a little bit further detail, and they talk about minimizing saturated and trans fats, which is very much smart, logical process. And they also talk about limiting sugar from beverages, which also is a smart move. You can imagine how many calories are in a soda, right? When they talk about this in the book, they talk about women should have about 100 calories per day from beverages, and men should have about 150 calories per day. So, it's a matter of, if you have a Coke, if you have a coffee and you add sugar, whatever that may be, if you are, for a female, if you're about 6 teaspoons of sugar, or, if you look at just 100 calories, if you're at about 30 grams or 45 grams for men, you're adding a little too much sugar into your diet. And they also talk about having a limit on the amount of sugar being about 10% of the calories per day. And I can pretty much guess that most of the people that we're going to come across have no concept of these guidelines, and quite frankly, don't limit sugar in their diet unless it's omniapparent, like it's a donut or if it's some kind of dessert in front of them. And many clients will view like sweetened beverages or something like a Gatorade or other sport drinks to be beneficial, when in fact they're loaded with sugar as well. So with exercise prescription, in terms of lifestyle here, let me roll myself out of the way. We talk a lot about the amount of time. It's the cumulative amount of time over the course of a week. And what they're suggesting here is it's 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity over the course of a week, or 75 minutes of vigorous activity over the course of a week. Now, as I said in my previous presentation, when you're working with any client, let alone obese clients, if you're manipulating this as a variable and you're doing perhaps moderate intensity one day and vigorous the next day, and you're doing different durations for each, you're ahead of the game of most trainers and people who just come in and work out on their own, because you're manipulating a variable that is a stressor on the body, and that'll give us a training response. And you're seeing that a little bit in class when you're working with your clients. We've already manipulated some of the variables in terms of the stressors that we're placing on these in these workouts, and you've seen the results and how your clients respond. So you'd like to have a combination of these over the course of a week, and you'd like to also have at least 2 days of muscle activity, meaning some type of resistance training in there as well, to really derive all the benefits. So it comes down to a conversation of, is your client going to come in and do long, slow distance on their own? Then that would be probably the moderate intensity activity. They would do that on their own. and they would see you for the strength training, or they would see you for the vigorous intensity physical activity, right? So you don't have to stand next to somebody while they're walking on a treadmill. It's kind of boring for everybody involved. It's not a good use of your time, and their money. But this stuff is where you get to really shine and really work with your people, whether it's the 75 minutes of vigorous intensity or 2 days of moderate intensity strength training. Those are the areas where you can really shine. So I'm going to jump off this and move on to my next presentation.